Yesterday, a memo circulated through private diplomatic channels in Ottawa that effectively signals the end of the North American automotive industry as we know it. This was not a routine trade update, it was a structural ambush. While Canadian officials were looking the other way, American and Mexican negotiators sat down in Mexico City and laid out a demand that fractures 30 years of continental integration. Washington is officially demanding that 50% of every single vehicle built in North America must consist of purely American content, or face immediate, crushing tariffs. Canada was not consulted, not invited, and not even mentioned once in the room. This is not a minor policy tweak. This is an existential threat to Canada's economic backbone. The stakes are measured in the survival of communities across Ontario. Today, 130,000 Canadians work directly in automotive manufacturing, and another 473,000 support jobs depend entirely on this ecosystem. A staggering 25% of all Ontario merchandise exports flow directly from these auto plants. If you want to understand how deep the structural dependency runs, consider this. Only 12% of vehicles manufactured in Canada are sold domestically. The remaining 88% ship straight across the border into American markets. To see the full chessboard, we have to look past the surface-level talking points coming out of Ottawa. Here is the timeline to keep things clear, because this crisis did not appear out of thin air. The groundwork was laid back in July 2020, when the USMCA officially replaced NAFTA. Under those rules, vehicles required 75% regional North American content to move tariff-free. Crucially, no specific single-country content mandate existed anywhere in the text. That critical absence is exactly what Washington has spent the last year trying to rewrite. The pressure intensified when a 25% auto tariff went live, defying USMCA rules and breaking supply chain confidence. While those tariffs were technically vacated in February 2026 after legal challenges, the damage was done. Automakers were already quietly reassessing their North American investment plans. That brought us to late May 2026 in Mexico City. US officials walked in with a deliberate divide-and-conquer strategy, choosing to negotiate with Mexico bilaterally while completely sidelining Canada. US Trade Representative Grier formally confirmed the bilateral format, forcing Canada's Minister Dominic LeBlanc to scramble for an emergency meeting in Washington. But polite words in Washington do not change the reality on the ground. A third round of US-Mexico talks is already locked in, purposefully scheduled past the mandatory July 1st USMCA joint review deadline. Canada is being systematically locked out of the room while its primary industrial pillar is rewritten. The official narrative from Washington frames this as a simple technical adjustment to protect regional jobs. But here is the other half of the story that most mainstream coverage completely misses. The 50% rule is a deliberate architectural tool designed to demote Canada from an equal trading partner into a secondary, captive supplier. Under the current USMCA, North America functions as a single, unified manufacturing bloc. If Washington successfully implements a 50% mandatory US content threshold, that bloc fractures from the inside out. American content takes the top tier automatically, leaving Canadian and Mexican suppliers to fiercely compete for whatever remains of the other 50%. The gap between this political demand and industrial reality is catastrophic. Look at the hard numbers compiled by American University's Kogod School, which tracks actual domestic content across North American vehicles. In 2026, only 109 vehicle models meet a 51% US content threshold, a drop from 123 qualifying vehicles the year before. Compliance is actually moving backward. The vast majority of those qualifying models are built in domestic Tesla facilities. Legacy automakers like General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis are nowhere near this threshold. Consider a practical example. The GMC Terrain currently carries just 11% US content by value. Under Washington's new mandate, that single model misses compliance by a massive 39 points. Automakers cannot simply turn on a dime and re-engineer deeply integrated supply chains without exploding their production costs. Think about the physical reality of Ontario's automotive ecosystem. A single engine block can cross the Canada-US border up to 8 times during production. If a tariff regime hits those border crossings, the integrated model collapses under its own weight. Brian Kingston of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, warned that rules this aggressive will render North American manufacturing entirely uncompetitive on a global scale. The alarming concrete scenario now facing Ontario is that Japanese production, even with standard tariffs factored in, could undercut Canadian-built vehicles. This structural threat directly targets billions of dollars in recent Canadian strategic investments. Ottawa recently placed massive, high-stakes bets to anchor the global EV transition right here in Canada. Volkswagen committed $7 billion to a gigafactory in St. Thomas, Ontario. Nexstar Energy poured $5 billion into a battery plant in Windsor. Ford committed $1.8 billion to convert Oakville into an EV hub, while Honda invested $1.38 billion to upgrade Alliston. Even Windsor Assembly added a third production shift to maximize output. Every single one of these boardroom decisions was made under the absolute assumption of USMCA stability and friction-free market access by targeting the core logic of continental integration. Washington is forcing international investors to recalculate their risk. If these multi-billion-dollar facilities cannot guarantee tariff-free access to their primary market, their strategic alignment evaporates. Sourcing components away from Canadian suppliers to meet American mandates will drive consumer prices up, but every compliance point gained in the United States represents a direct, permanent loss for Canadian factories. The political response from Ottawa reveals a severe lack of leverage. While the Prime Minister's office called the exclusion from the Mexico City talks deeply troubling, condemnation is not a strategy. Unifor, the union representing Canadian auto workers, has already labelled the proposal an existential threat, warning that thousands of assembly jobs could vanish within a decade. Behind closed doors, the panic is already turning into corporate action. Southern Ontario parts suppliers are quietly modelling worst-case relocation scenarios. Executives at Magna and Linamar have privately briefed investors on supply chain contingency plans. Because both companies source heavily from Mexico, any sudden pivot to American-only content carries massive, immediate retooling costs. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has demanded a direct seat at any renegotiated table, pointing out that excluding Ontario ignores the foundational backbone of continental trade. Canadian diplomats are frantically lobbying US governors in states like Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, states whose own assembly lines rely on Ontario-made components every single day. This economic interdependence is Canada's strongest unspoken argument, and some American legislators are quietly worried that the rule will backfire on their own domestic consumer prices. Detroit-based legacy automakers are also lobbying Washington for flexibility. But federal political pressures in the US continue to favour blunt economic nationalism over complex trade partnerships. Make sure you are subscribed to Money Signals and hit that like button so this analysis never passes you by. As the July 1st deadline passes without Canada even entering the negotiating room, the hidden costs of delay grow heavier every day. Automakers operate on long-term capital allocation cycles. They will not wait indefinitely for trade tribunals or diplomatic breakthroughs. If corporate boardrooms conclude that Canada is no longer a stable repository for automotive capital, future investments will simply redirect south of the border permanently. Once that industrial cluster begins to unravel, reversing the bleed becomes nearly impossible. Ottawa is now trapped in a shrinking box, with three distinct corporate and bureaucratic factions pulling in opposite directions. The first path on the table is outright capitulation, accepting Washington's terms to preserve market access at the cost of national manufacturing sovereignty. The second path is open confrontation through formal dispute channels, a legal route that takes years while real-world tariffs return to hollow out Ontario's towns. The third path is an aggressive domestic reinvention, which requires billions in patient, long-term capital that Canada has traditionally struggled to deploy. Bureaucrats are floating desperate compromises, like demanding extra content credit for Canadian critical minerals like nickel, cobalt, and lithium. But Washington has shown zero interest in trading finished assembly jobs for upstream raw minerals. The silence hanging over Ontario's assembly towns right now is deceptive. It is the strange calm that precedes a permanent economic realignment. The demands have been formally delivered, the trilateral format has collapsed, and Canada's leverage is eroding by the week. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. To understand exactly how this structural ambush operates, we have to look past the political theatre and dissect the cold, technical architecture of the proposal currently sitting on the table in Mexico City. What Washington has presented to Mexican negotiators is not a loose set of guidelines. It is a highly specific, three-pronged overhaul of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement's automotive rules of origin. This new architecture is designed to fundamentally dismantle the existing Continental framework and replace it with a system where national boundaries within North America dictate economic survival. The mechanics of this proposed deal break down into three precise, interlocking components. First, Washington is demanding an immediate increase in the overall regional value content threshold. Under the current USMCA rules established in 2020, a passenger vehicle must contain 75% North American regional content to cross borders completely tariff-free. The new proposal aggressively jacks that baseline requirement up to 82%. This means that 82% of every single component, from the engine block down to the smallest electronic sensor, must be sourced from within the continent. This initial pillar is designed to aggressively squeeze out third-country inputs, specifically targeting parts and raw materials flowing into North American assembly lines from supply chains in Asia. MexicoBusiness.News 1 second, and far more lethal for Canadian industry, is the introduction of a rigid country-specific mandate, a 50% purely American content requirement. For the first time in the history of North American free trade, the United States is abandoning the concept of a unified regional bloc. Under this rule, it is no longer enough for a vehicle to be made in North America. Half of the total manufacturing value of that vehicle must originate specifically within the geographic borders of the United States. This 50% requirement acts as a hard filter before a vehicle can qualify for duty-free status, completely upending how automakers calculate their supply chain compliance. MexicoBusiness.News third. This new architecture systematically dismantles the labour value content provision that Canada and Mexico originally relied on during the 2018 negotiations. Under the existing 2020 framework, the agreement used a wage-based threshold requiring that 40% to 45% of a vehicle's value be produced by workers earning at least $16 per hour. That rule was originally intended to protect high-wage manufacturing jurisdictions like Ontario and the US Midwest from being undercut by lower-wage assembly lines. Washington's new 2026 architecture explicitly shifts the mechanism away from labour value protections and replaces them entirely with these raw, geographic, country-specific content requirements. MexicoBusiness.News. The key players driving this overhaul are operating with a clear, synchronized strategic agenda. The American delegation is led by Deputy U.S. Trade Representative Jeffrey Gottman, working under the direct mandate of a protectionist administration focused squarely on reshoring industrial production. On the other side of the table sits Mexico's Economy Ministry, operating under President Claudia Sheinbaum. While Mexico is a target of Washington's broader trade pressures, Mexican negotiators have made a cold, calculated decision to participate in these bilateral sessions without Canada. By keeping the talks strictly bilateral, Mexico City is actively trying to insulate its own massive assembly network, gambling that it can secure specific structural carve-outs or transition timelines for Mexican factories by offering early concessions to Washington. MexicoBusiness.News. Show 1. The financial terms embedded in this text are designed to act as an immediate enforcement hammer. If an automaker fails to hit both the 82% regional threshold and the 50% specific US content rule, the vehicle loses its preferential USMCA status entirely. It doesn't just face a minor administrative penalty, it defaults straight to standard tariff regimes. In the current volatile trade climate, that means facing auto tariffs that could climb up to 25%. Matching the extra legal tariff barriers that shook the industry throughout 2025 to illustrate how punishing these terms are. Consider the financial reality for international automakers operating inside Ontario. For a vehicle built at Honda's Alliston plant or Toyota's facilities in Cambridge, losing USMCA status means that shipping that car to its primary buyers in the United States becomes costlier than importing a vehicle directly from Japan. Currently, cars imported into the US from the European Union or Japan face a standard 15% tariff. Under Washington's proposed text, a Canadian-built car that misses the 50% US content mark could be hit with a 25% penalty. This creates an absurd distortion, where continental integration is penalised more heavily than global outsourcing. Latinvex.com, the strategic logic behind this design is a deliberate effort by the United States to address what it views as free riding within the North American market. From Washington's perspective, the current 75% regional rule allowed automakers to set up assembly hubs in Canada and Mexico, pull in a significant minority of cheaper components from overseas, and still exploit duty-free access to the massive American consumer market. By enforcing an 82% regional floor and a 50% American ceiling, the United States is effectively forcing corporate boardrooms to make a binary choice: either move your parts sourcing and final assembly lines directly into the United States, or accept that your Canadian investments will be permanently locked out of the continental market. This is why the bilateral format of the talks in Mexico City is so significant. This morning, while official press releases from the meetings spun a narrative of constructive environments and frank dialogues regarding regional competitiveness, the true architecture tells a story of systematic isolation. The United States has deliberately structured these negotiations to exploit its asymmetric leverage over each neighbour individually. By dealing with Mexico first, Washington can lock in terms that favour American manufacturing while utilising Mexico's lower production costs as a benchmark, effectively presenting Canada with a finished deal later this summer. MexicoBusiness.news. Make sure you're subscribed to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis, and hit that like button so you can stay ahead of these structural shifts. For Canada, this technical architecture represents a complete unwinding of the assumptions that have governed billions of dollars in automotive capital since the 1990s. The integrated supply chains that allow parts to move seamlessly across the Detroit River are being targeted by a policy that treats national borders as absolute economic barriers. MexicoBusiness.news. Every single provision within this proposed overhaul is sequenced to extract structural concessions before the formal trilateral review can even begin. By moving the goalposts from regional cooperation to country-specific mandates, Washington is actively rewriting the economic geography of the continent. The technical details of this text show that the United States is no longer interested in managing a shared trading bloc. It is interested in dominating it. But as these bilateral meetings proceed toward a third round this summer, the most consequential question remains unanswered. The deliberate exclusion of Canada from bilateral automotive negotiations in Mexico City exposes a structural vulnerability built on decades of asymmetric trade dependency. By replacing regional integration with a rigid 50% domestic content mandate, Washington is systematically dismantling the continental trading bloc to assert absolute industrial dominance. This is the geometric unwinding of a 30-year geopolitical consensus. For decades, the prevailing doctrine in both Ottawa and Washington held that North America operated as a single, indivisible manufacturing engine. The pre-Trump era was characterized by an institutionalized faith in trilateral mechanisms, where dispute resolution panels, harmonized standards, and rules-based trade insulated middle powers like Canada from raw economic coercion. Today, that rules-based veneer has cracked completely. Washington's actions demonstrate that the United States no longer views its northern neighbour as an essential strategic partner, but rather as a captive market and a secondary supplier to be managed through bilateral ultimatums. This shift alters the fundamental calculus of Canada-US relations, replacing diplomatic deference with an era of naked transactionalism that's storming out to the global stage. This policy reveals the true shape of American geoeconomic strategy in the late 2020s. As Washington seeks to decouple from adversarial supply chains and insulate its domestic economy from rising Asian manufacturing prowess, it is simultaneously transforming North America into a protectionist fortress. However, within that fortress, there is only room for one sovereign master. This aggressive reshoring effort signals to global allies in Europe and Asia that proximity to the American market no longer guarantees economic security. If Washington is willing to sacrifice the economic stability of its closest geographic ally and largest trading partner to achieve domestic political objectives, traditional security guarantees across NATO and the G7 take on a more fragile dimension. Alliances are being subordinated to the raw demands of domestic electoral politics and industrial nationalism. The lesson for the rest of the world is unmistakable. Continental integration under the shadow of a superpower is a temporary privilege, not a permanent right. The immediate crisis may be concentrated within the $140 billion automotive sector. But the structural precedent threatens every critical dimension of the Canadian economy. Consider the energy sector, where Canada ships over 4 million barrels of crude oil per day to American refineries, alongside massive cross-border electricity grids. If Washington successfully normalizes country-specific content mandates in automotive manufacturing, the strategic architecture exists to apply similar mercantilist filters to continental energy distribution or critical mineral supply chains. Ottawa's multi-billion-dollar bets on the electric vehicle transition, ensured by Volkswagen's $7 billion gigafactory in St. Thomas and Nexstar's $5 billion plant in Windsor, were designed to position Canada as the indispensable green supplier to the continent. This new 50% rule weaponizes that very positioning, proving that without guaranteed, friction-free market access, upstream mineral wealth cannot protect downstream assembly jobs. Even the defence sector, long protected by the integrated industrial base of the 1956 Defence Production Sharing Agreement, faces an environment where the definition of national security is being broadened to encompass pure economic protectionism. This reality exposes the profound danger of Canada's structural dependency. When 88% of your automotive output ships directly into a single foreign market, your national sovereignty is functionally tethered to the domestic political cycles of that neighbour. The pre-Trump trade architecture allowed Canadian policymakers to ignore this vulnerability by mistaking continental integration for permanent economic safety. Now, the illusion has vanished. Shifting production away from Canadian suppliers to satisfy a mandatory American threshold does not just raise vehicle prices for consumers, it systematically hollows out the tax bases of manufacturing towns across southern Ontario. The economic modelling from the C.D. Howe Institute showing potential job losses exceeding 50,000 positions represents a permanent contraction of provincial manufacturing GDP. It creates a structural deficit that provincial tax incentives or federal loan guarantees cannot bridge. As corporate boardrooms prioritise compliance certainty over localised financial subsidies, by systematically targeting the core logic of the integrated border, Washington has exposed the limits of Canada's traditional diplomatic toolkit. For decades, Canada relied on state-level lobbying, mobilising governors in Michigan, Ohio and Indiana, whose own assembly lines depend on Ontario-made parts. While those supply chain linkages remain physically real, they are no longer politically decisive in a Washington, driven by a zero-sum view of international trade. The interdependence that once functioned as Canada's strongest unspoken shield is being overridden by an administrative strategy that values domestic assembly jobs above cross-border efficiency. This leaves Ottawa with rapidly shrinking leverage as Mexico's willingness to negotiate bilaterally isolates Canada further within the collapsing trilateral framework. The immediate horizon offers no comfortable exit ramps for Canadian negotiators. As the symbolic July 1st USMCA joint review deadline passes without a trilateral framework in place, the true pressure begins to mount. A third round of US-Mexico negotiations is locked in for late July, intentionally operating outside the formal boundaries of the original agreement. The next critical juncture will arrive as international automakers face irreversible capital allocation deadlines for the 2028 and 2030 vehicle production cycles. Boardrooms will not wait for Ottawa to exhaust its legal options through slow-moving dispute resolution mechanisms while a 25% tariff penalty looms over their supply chains. The Canadian government will be forced to choose between executing an immediate, incredibly costly pivot toward alternative global markets, or offering devastating concessions in unrelated sectors like dairy or supply-managed agriculture just to buy back a seat at a table that Washington has already broken. The clock is no longer ticking in Canada's favour, and the structural decisions made in the shadow of this midsummer standoff will dictate the sovereign trajectory of the Canadian economy for the next generation.